This is Duke University.
Please give a big round of applause to Josh Sommer.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, guys. Thanks so much, Howie. Good to see everyone. Good evening. Really great to be back here at Duke, and kind of hard to believe that 10 years ago, I was in the same shoes that many of you are in. I was an undergrad here at Duke and had an idea, a passion that I was trying to get off the ground. In my case, it was this startup to try to find a cure for this disease that I had, chordoma. And fortunately, as I'm sure many of you are going to find, Duke turned out to be an incredibly fertile environment for this idea to take root. And now, fast forward 10 years later, it has come to fruition and turned into the Chordoma Foundation, which is now leading an international effort involving patients and doctors and scientists and drug companies to drive forward treatments for this rare cancer. So I thought I'd just give you some highlights of that experience of starting the organization and where we've come in the last 10 years, and hopefully that might provide some ideas or inspiration for those of you who are starting organizations of your own. So the story really starts back in 2006 when I was a freshman here at Duke and was here in Pratt studying environmental engineering, having just a great time, when all of a sudden I started coming down with really severe headaches. And as you can imagine, as you can probably predict, those headaches were not a good sign. They ultimately led to the discovery of a tumor that was situated right in the very center of my head. So if you could imagine drawing a line from ear to ear and back from your nose, right where those two lines would intersect, there was a tumor sitting there in what surgeons sometimes call high-value real estate, a really bad place for a tumor to be. So to make a long story short, as you can imagine, this was just earth-shattering for me. It was just a really devastating blow to hear that I had this tumor in my head, and it launched me on this saga to try to get a diagnosis and to try to find an appropriate treatment. So as you can see here, I wound up having surgery to remove the tumor. It was a 10-hour operation. They went through my nose. Thankfully, I came out of the operation with all my senses intact, and they were able to remove the entire tumor, which was great. Unfortunately, it turned out to be this obscure cancer called chordoma, which I'd certainly never heard of, and I'd be very surprised if anyone here has ever heard of it as well. I'd soon find out that this is a disease that you really don't want to have. It's a rare bone cancer. Aside from occurring in the head where mine was, it can occur anywhere along the spine. It affects people of all ages, but the real challenge is that even though I had a successful surgery, even after surgery, the tumor still tends to come back. And eventually, maybe you can have another surgery, maybe you can have radiation, but eventually you exhaust treatment options. You exhaust the ability to have more surgery and radiation. And at that point, there were no effective drugs that could control the tumor. And so as a result, because of that high recurrence rate after surgery and radiation, because there are no effective drug therapies, the average survival at the time was about 7 years, and the overall cure rate was about 20%. So you can imagine being 18 years old at the time and having a lot to look forward to. I really didn't want to accept those statistics, and I became determined to try to do everything in my power to try to change them. And as I imagine many of you would do if you were confronted with a similar situation, my first step was to try to kind of wrap my head around what this challenge was, what this disease was that I was facing. And so I went to Google. Eventually, I went to the medical literature and just started plowing through every article I could find. It didn't look like there was that much happening in the field. There weren't that many papers published on chordoma. It didn't look like there was much work being done to develop better therapies. So it was, at first, a kind of confusing and discouraging endeavor to go and learn about this disease. But I stumbled upon an article that piqued my interest, and I didn't have any idea what it was about, but what piqued my interest was the fact that the lead author, Michael Kelly, happened to be located none other than here at Duke, right in my backyard. So when I got back to campus after having surgery and trying to plug in and find a way to make an impact in this disease that I'd just been diagnosed with, I reached out to Dr. Kelly to try to learn about the work that he was doing, to try to understand the challenges that he might be facing, to try to see if there's some way that I might be able to help. And to make a long story short, Dr. Kelly needed an extra pair of hands in the lab, and so 2 weeks later, I show up, not having ever taken a biology class, not having had any lab experience, and there I am. I'm going to cure chordoma, joining the Kelly lab. So yeah, I heard some laughs. You're right to laugh. It was a naive assumption. I realized that I had a lot to learn, and so I wound up switching majors. I took molecular biology classes and genetics classes, and really kind of became inspired and fell in love with the work in the lab. But it was a really eye-opening experience for a number of reasons. On the one hand, learning about the advances that were going on in cancer research at the moment, learning about the technologies that we had at our disposal was incredibly energizing and inspiring, and gave me a lot of hope. On the other hand, we were running into a number of challenges in trying to do the experiments that we had set out to take on. For one, we didn't have access to the basic materials that we needed, things like tumor tissue and cell lines in animal models. And not only that, but there were some cell lines that were circulating out there, and one of my first discoveries was, in fact, that 4 out of the 5 cell lines that had been reported turned out to be invalid. So that meant that any work that we did with them would be essentially meaningless and might actually lead us down a wrong path. Aside from not having the materials that we needed, we didn't have enough funding to do the work we wanted to do, and we were working in complete isolation. And so it became clear pretty quickly that in order to really make an impact, there was only so much that one lab could do, and that to really move the needle, it required bringing the expertise of many more labs to bear and creating the conditions for companies to get involved as well. And so to take that on and to solve those problems, in 2007, my mother and I and a handful of other patients and family members from across the country, we got together and started the Chordoma Foundation with a 2-pronged mission. First, to improve the lives of those affected by the disease, and secondly, to lead the search for a cure. And the kind of inspiration for the Chordoma Foundation came out of one evening sitting in my dorm at Duke, and starting off, it was very much a kitchen table operation. This was a picture from one of our very first board meetings at the house of one of our board members in Chapel Hill. And there we were. I was an undergrad at Duke. None of us had ever done this before, trying to figure out how do you start an organization to take on this rare cancer for which pretty much nothing was happening. And we realized we were up against a pretty big challenge. As I mentioned, there was just a handful of researchers studying chordoma. At that point, we knew very little about the biology of the disease. There had been one clinical trial that was ever done in chordoma. In all of history, one clinical trial that was ever done, and there were 0 companies working on it. And we learned pretty quickly that getting research going and developing new treatments is a very costly endeavor. So some of you may be familiar, but it takes on average 10 to 15 years and over $1 billion to bring a drug to market. And so we said, oh my gosh, how on earth for this tiny disease that affects maybe 5,000 or 10,000 patients in North America and Europe, how are we going to raise that sort of money? How can we possibly develop a new treatment for this disease? And so that launched this period of exploration. And fortunately, Duke turned out to be a really terrific place to do that. I was able to take a couple semesters of independent study with some of the faculty here that you see, and was able to leverage so many resources across campus here in the business school, the School of Engineering, the medical school, public policy, and learn so much about the ecosystem and really the system in which we operate. fortunately, what I learned opened some doors. So for one, and this was as a non-biologist certainly news to me, what I didn't realize was that even though cancers can occur in different parts of the body, there can be a lot of shared biology between them, such that a treatment that works for a subset of lung cancer might also work for a subset of breast cancer, might also work for a rare type of kidney cancer. And what that means is that, in fact, many cancer drugs, or the majority of cancer drugs that are developed these days are actually developed for more than one type of cancer. So that was great. That means we don't necessarily have to develop a drug just for chordoma. Furthermore, it may be the case that there could already be a drug that exists for this disease. There are about 200 cancer drugs on the market already, and at any given time, about 1,000 more that are in development. So, it could be the case that we could find one of those that work for chordoma. The other interesting thing that we learned is that there are significant incentives that companies have to develop drugs for rare diseases. They can sometimes get their drug to market faster, sometimes the development costs can be lower. And in fact, many companies have adopted the strategy of intentionally seeking out rare diseases, and in particular rare cancers, to pursue approvals for the drugs that they're developing. So that led us to a hypothesis. We said, all right, given all that, we see potentially 3 paths to get a drug developed for chordoma. Either we find a drug that's already on the market, or we go and find a drug that is not yet on the market but is being developed, and we help make chordoma the path to approval for that drug. Or, depending on where the biology of the disease leads us, we might have to actually develop a new drug de novo. But based on what we learned, what we hypothesized was that if we can sufficiently de-risk the path to market, if we can make it easy enough for a company to potentially get a drug approved for chordoma, that the companies will invest and take it the rest of the way. But even doing that, we reckoned would require a lot of investment, and we didn't think that kind of the traditional business as usual model of just raising money and giving it away to researchers was going to cut it. That we couldn't possibly move quickly enough, and we couldn't possibly raise enough money using that model. And so we went around and we studied what a number of effective organizations, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, for example, the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and others had done, and recognized that there was an opportunity to take a much more proactive approach to driving research. An approach that systematically identifies research priorities as opposed to passively waits for researchers to apply to us for funding. A systems-oriented approach that seeks to develop an ecosystem that supports and enables chordoma research as opposed to just investing in individual projects. Rather than just using grants, which are not always the most efficient mechanism to get research done, employing prizes and in some cases contract research, whatever is most effective to achieve the objective that had been identified as a priority by our scientific advisory board. And then in particular, recognizing that we are a small patient population, unlikely to muster huge amounts of money, trying to be as high leverage as possible and not measuring our success by the amount that we invest, but rather finding ways that we can attract outside sources of capital to invest in chordoma. So kind of distilling that and operationalizing it, we came up with essentially a 3-point research plan. First, to build and cultivate a vibrant research community. Second, to develop the enabling infrastructure to make their work possible. And third, to strategically and proactively invest in that research. Much like where our finalists are tonight, we were kind of at this inflection point with an idea, but needed a little bit of a boost to be able to to actually put it to the test and get the organization going. And while I did not participate in the Startup Challenge, I was very fortunate to receive seed funding from an analogous organization called Echoing Green, which focuses on social ventures and nonprofits. And this really provided that critical boost at exactly the stage that when we were taking off, that allowed us to essentially catapult and put our ideas into practice. So fast forward 10 years, where have we come? Over the last 10 years, we've built a community of over 300 researchers in 12 different countries, all working together to develop treatments for this disease. We've united this community through 5 international research workshops. We've been able to demonstrate that the community has become increasingly interconnected and that this is leading to new collaborations which are making possible research that would not otherwise get done. We've built an end-to-end research infrastructure, including a biobank to provide tumor tissue, repositories of cell lines and animal models, and a drug screening pipeline that makes it quick and efficient to test drugs in preclinical models to generate the data needed to justify clinical trials. So we set some ambitious goals when we started in 2007, and we've come quite a long way to achieving those goals. We've almost reached the number of tissue samples we've set out to acquire. We've surpassed the number of cell lines. Keep in mind there was only one cell line when we started, and we're well on our way to alleviating the scarcity of animal models in the field. Over that time period, we've invested systematically in over 30 labs, a total of $5 million. And to the best of our ability, we estimate that that's leveraged about $20 million in outside funding, whether it be from academia or from industry. All of that has resulted in this huge uptick in research progress. 47 new publications have emerged from it. And what's really exciting is that that's actually leading to new ideas about how to treat the disease. We've identified, and our collaborators have identified, quite a number of promising drug targets for which there are drugs already available that could be repurposed. And one new drug target that is perhaps the most promising, for which there aren't existing drugs, where we are now embarking upon trying to discover drugs that target this new gene, brachyury, which was first associated with cancer in chordoma, but subsequently has been implicated in many other tumor types, in breast cancer and lung cancer and prostate cancer. So we think the market for developing a drug against this target is far larger than chordoma. The challenges that we faced was, as ideas and new discoveries started bubbling up out of labs across the world, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started noticing that there was a log jam in actually translating those discoveries into new therapies for patients, getting these therapies out of the lab and into patients. And that critical step was getting them into clinical trials, to actually put them to the test in the clinic. And what we found was that as we were talking with companies and trying to get clinical trials started, there were a number of different obstacles that we faced. But most importantly was simply a disbelief that we could actually bring patients to those trials, that the trials would even be able to attract enough patients to get a result. And that disbelief, that conventional wisdom that running clinical trials in a rare cancer like chordoma was just impossible, was standing in the way of actually translating these discoveries into therapies for patients. And so we took a step back, and we'd always had this two-pronged mission of improving the lives of patients and leading the search for a cure. But as a upstart organization, having limited resources and needing to focus, we really focused primarily on the research side of our mission. But we recognized that we were actually in a very good position to solve that problem, because we were the organization that was the go-to source for information for the patient community. So we made a decision in 2014 to broaden our focus and really to view patient services as not something kind of parallel to research or separate from research, but really inextricably linked with research by providing the resources, the support, the information that patients need and desire throughout their journey with the disease. We are able to connect with those patients and develop relationships over time, so that if and when the need arises for them to participate in a clinical trial, we're not at that point trying to go out and find them, but we've already established that relationship, and there's already trust built. So since 2014, we've connected with and served about 75% of the US patient population. We've provided individualized one-on-one support to over 1,200 patients from the US and 40 other countries. And now when we go to companies or investigators about starting clinical trials, the conversation is very different. We have a compelling data package. We have the preclinical models that are needed to test the drugs. We have an organized and motivated research and physician community. And now we have the organized and mobilized patient community. And so those conversations are going very different. And now over the last several years, that's led to this kind of explosive growth in new clinical trials. So there's 7 clinical trials that are being planned right now, 2 of which have started, 5 more in the works. And we're now partnering with 13 different companies that are investing in Chordoma, 6 of which you can see there. So the hypothesis that we started out with, that if we could make Chordoma a feasible proposition for companies that they would invest, seems to be panning out, at least initially. So we find ourselves at this very exciting moment. Many seeds have been planted. Many of the obstacles that we once faced, in fact, the obstacles that I was facing when I was working in the lab at Duke, have largely been overcome. We now find ourselves at this incredible moment where we're really, everything has kind of converged in terms of having a motivated patient community, physician community, companies on board. We are embarking now on a 5-year strategic plan in which we aim to launch 10 clinical trials by 2020 to discover new drugs that target that new target that I was describing, brachyury, to bring the potential of immune therapy to this disease. You may have heard in the news that there's tremendous advances going on in immune therapy. And then to enhance and to expand our patient services to really benefit patients all over the world. Now, all of this is being made possible by a tremendous group of supporters across the world: patients, family members, donors, people doing bike rides and galas and mountain climbs. And it wouldn't be possible without that dedicated community that's come together to make this idea come to fruition. But most importantly, it's made possible by the hard work of our team. I'm so proud of the team that we've developed over the years, some of whom are here tonight. These are really the folks that are making the work possible day to day. And it's an exciting moment because our team is growing. We're very happy to have just hired our first director of research, who has a 25-year career in drug discovery, both in industry and more recently as vice president of research at one of our most effective peer organizations. And we're continuing to grow and continuing to hire. So certainly if anyone here is interested in the kind of work that we're doing, would welcome the opportunity to speak. We have internships and a number of positions that we're going to be adding in the coming years. So I'm just so delighted to be back. I'm so looking forward to the pitches tonight. I'm sure that some of you are going to be standing up here giving a keynote in years ahead. And I wish everyone good luck tonight. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Josh. We actually do have time for a few questions here. So if any of you in the audience have any questions for Josh about anything, we welcome you to ask it right now. We'll take about 3 to 5 questions here. So who has a question? Anybody? Yes, on the right.
How are you doing?
Thanks for asking. I'm doing very well. So it's hard to believe, but at 11 years and no sign of recurrence. Thank you.
In the middle.
Yeah.
How do you commercialize that, something that's so personal into affect your business? Like, how do you make that transition into educating investors and people to come on board with you? How do you commercialize that passion?
Do you mind repeating the question just for
Yeah, so the question is, how do you take something that is so personal and commercialize that and turn it into a pitch that resonates with investors or supporters? So yeah, you're right. At the outset, the motivation was really one of self-preservation. I felt as though I was in a race against time, and this was an urgent personal mission. As time has gone on, the motivation has really evolved. So working in the lab, I caught the bug of science and became just completely enthralled in the scientific problems that we were trying to solve, and that provided excitement and motivation, and for other scientists was also motivational. As we started connecting with more patients and the foundation expanded into the patient community, many of my closest friends are now other patients and people who have gotten involved in the organization. And so while I'm very thankful to be doing well, unfortunately, many people who I've come to know are not doing as well. And so we see it on a daily basis, the urgent need for better treatments. But then the final thing, the kind of final stage in that progression is what we've realized is that chordoma is not at all unique. There are hundreds and hundreds of rare cancers that are all facing similar challenges, many of which could benefit from the same solutions. And so we view what we're building at the Chordoma Foundation as essentially a kind of a laboratory for how do you do rare cancer research more efficiently and more effectively. And there's some things that we've developed that have already started to be adopted by other organizations. And so that's, seeing the Chordoma Foundation as a model is something that has caught the attention of more philanthropists and larger donors. And because of that, just actually in the last year, we've received $4 million investments, which is really catapulting us to kind of a next level. And largely that's because people see this. Not only are we at this incredible moment for chordoma, where it seems like no longer are better treatments a decade away, they're potentially possible within years, but also our success and what we're doing here could potentially lead to insights and models and solutions that could benefit other cancers as well.
A couple more questions. Yes, in the front.
If a big company planning to buy your company, were you willing to sell your company to such kind of big company?
Do you mind repeating that question?
Yeah, so the question is if a big company came along and wanted to buy the organization, would we sell? So as a nonprofit, we're not in a position to sell to a company. However, our hope is that as we begin to identify therapies that target this new target, brachyury, that will lead to intellectual property. And it may be the case that intellectual property is developed or emerges out of a university that we partner with. But because we now own and control all of the means of research, the tumor tissue, the cell lines, the animal models, we have the ability to actually do research of our own through contract labs. We don't have any wet labs of our own, but we're doing research through contract labs that could lead to discoveries that the Chordoma Foundation would own that could be commercialized. And so we very much see the potential and would welcome the opportunity, if such a technology were to be developed, to license that or to sell it to a company. We hope that we wind up in such a situation.
One last question. Don't be shy. Okay, well, let's give one last big round of applause for Josh. Thank you so much for coming out here. Thank you. Appreciate you, man. Thank you.